There are so many words to describe light and shadow, and to make matters more confusing, lots of different words that describe the same thing. Looking at all of this, it's difficult to know where to start. There's the classic sphere that's always used to demonstrate these terms, which is a very helpful example, but it's difficult to look at this and know how to apply it, let alone to anything other than a sphere. Honestly, some of these words are more important than others to focus on, and trying to learn all of them at once is making things more complicated than they need to be. So, here's an overview of what I think are the most important to know, and how to actually apply them in your art. Here's a one-question pop quiz. If someone is outside during a sunny day, but they are sitting completely in the shade, can you still see their face? Or are they a completely dark silhouette? Hopefully, you know that the person would still be quite visible, and that this is pretty obvious. But you should really think deeper about why this is. Why are things still visible when a light source like the sun doesn't hit them? This is because of ambient light, the first word you should know. Ambient light is light from the atmosphere or surrounding area. It's the main reason things in shadows aren't completely black. The more ambient light there is, the more visibility there is in shadow. Even in dark places, there's usually still some visibility, a little bit of ambient light. The complete absence of ambient light would be complete darkness, like inside a dark room with no windows. It's important to note that, no matter how much ambient light there is in this space, this is still a scene entirely in shadow. Think of ambient light as the light in shadow, the reason that shadows typically aren't completely black. Instead, shadows are the color from the ambient light. Basically, the color of the environment. A purple environment means that the ambient light is purple. A green environment means that the ambient light is green, and so on. Another thing you should notice about something that's fully in shadow is that not only is it generally not pure black, but also that it has visible form. This is not a flat shape with no inside detail. That's because of our second word, ambient occlusion. This is the occlusion of ambience, or in other words, ambient light being excluded from some areas on an object. It has a more difficult time reaching the nooks and crannies of a form, and so these ambient occlusion parts of a shadow will be darker than the rest of the shadow. In the classic sphere example, there is ambient occlusion right here, where this tucked underneath part of the sphere is hiding from the ambient light. Ambient occlusion is often soft, no hard edges, unless it's on the end of a plane or form. Also, even though these areas can be very dark, don't use pure black. This is a pretty firm rule for any rendered painterly art, even for the darkest ambient occlusion. With both ambient light and ambient occlusion on this character, it now looks like a convincing 3D form that's completely in shadow. Let's try adding some direct light now, our third word. Direct light is light that comes directly from a light source, like the sun or a lamp. Many artists, especially those just starting out, think about light and shadow in their process by starting with a completely lit object and then adding shadows. This works just fine, especially for certain styles like those with cell shading, but like I'm showing in this video, starting with shadow and then adding light can be a game changer for painting, and at least to me, makes understanding how all this works so much easier. It can also be easier to figure out where light will hit on an object than to figure out where it won't hit. It's time for the fourth and final most important word. This is bounce light. Similar to ambient light, it only affects shadows. The difference is that bounce light comes from objects instead of the ambience. There are multiple names for it, but I prefer calling it bounce light because it's when direct light hits an object, and some of this light bounces back up and into the shadow of another object. That's why in the sphere example, this part of the shadow is a bit lighter than the rest. The light hitting the ground here is bouncing back up into the shadow. If direct light hits a blue surface, the resulting bounce light will have that blue, and so on. In my painting here, the direct light hitting this yellow scarf will bounce up into the shadow areas nearby. You can also add bounce light from something nearby but out of view, like the ground. Since bounce light looks so nice and it's so fun to paint, you can make excuses like this to use it. Again, bounce light is only visible in shadow. If red light bounces off this object onto this one, the red will only appear in the shadow, not in the light area. It also shouldn't be very bright, not too much brighter than the rest of the shadow. Now that all four of these terms are gone over, here's some important concluding notes. Remember that direct light is always brighter than ambient and bounce light. Ambient and bounce light are the light in shadow, and your shadow values should be darker than your direct light values. It is the shadow area after all, don't forget to use logic. You should also have more detail in either your light or shadow area, not equally in both. If more detail is in shadow, then the areas of direct light will be washed out and probably very bright. Here's the steps I used on the art I made in this video: ambient light, ambient occlusion, direct light, and bounce light. If you ever forget how this all works, come back to this or give it a screenshot for reference use. If you'd like to see more, consider checking out one of these videos next. Thanks for watching!